Hello and welcome back. Following up on our previous video on the intricate and complex web of factors that culminated in the global pandemic pandemonium that is playing out in front of us today, in this video, we will see how we, as a global collective, could have handled this crisis much better, and more importantly, what options do we have, going forward from here. To be able to follow this discussion in its completeness, and to understand where each of the arguments is coming from, it is important that you have chewed and digested the analysis we had done in the previous video. You can watch this video by clicking on the link via the information icon, appearing in the top right-hand corner. So, with this preamble in place, let us proceed. We have seen how, because of the extreme and coercive corporatization of every aspect of our existence, under the influence of a handful, but an extremely powerful group of interests, and the political class and bureaucracy, betrothed to, and owned by this oligarchy, led to an abdication of duties of the state towards its citizens, and an overexploitation of the planet, its people, and its natural resources, and the environment. This eventually led to an impoverished existence for a large portion of humanity, all of which manifests itself in its completeness when the COVID-19 epidemic became a catalyst for a spectacular collapse of global leadership, public welfare and healthcare, commerce, and economics. Having identified the mechanism and causes that led to the collapse in global systems that we did in the previous video, we are now in a position to internalize the lessons we have learned, and think about putting in place a system that would ensure that we never repeat this chapter in our history. We can start this process by identifying how, even in the current configuration of our world, we could have avoided an absolute disintegration like this, and then, in light of this information, tried to trace an outline of systems and conditions that would ensure that an implosion like this never happens ever again. We now understand the components of an outbreak becoming a pandemic, and the pandemic leading to an all-round collapse were a delay in recognizing the problem on account of ignorance, arrogance and financial expediency, an underplaying of the scale of the problem, and delaying of appropriate response, placing economics before people's welfare, a systematic dismantling of the structures and institutions of public welfare, to further the interests of business and the oligarchs, and the adversarial and hostile behavior of governments and leaders, especially among the nations with most resources, and in the bastions of capitalism, along with a void in global leadership, both by politicians, as well as international institutions. Building on these, we can identify the conditions and actions, which, if they were in place and were used, could have considerably offset the magnitude and the impact of the epidemic, and could have minimized the large-scale collapse that we see today. The first, and arguably the most effective defense, in the face of a problem of this magnitude and proportions, would have been an atmosphere of greater trust and integration between the people, governments, and institutions of the world. If there was a higher level of social and economic cooperation, on both governmental as well as people-to-people levels, such conditions, on one side, would have made covering up of the breakout more difficult. On the other side, there would be far greater willingness to open up and seek assistance and share information. An environment of insularity, and the imperative to keep up the appearance of strength, in a world of trade and tariff wars and economic sanctions, there was an obstruction of timely flow of correct and complete information, leading to fatal delays, with lethal consequences. The next thing that could have severely impeded the brutality of the impact, would have been, if people-centric issues were the drivers of public policies and systems, rather than those of the rich, concerned only with the perpetuation and promotion of enriching of a minuscule minority. On account of the iron-fisted control of the super-wealthy and big business, each government action, in response to the crisis, was disproportionately skewed away from the interests of the group which was negatively affected the most, and instead, the calamity was used as an opportunity to channel more wealth towards the wealthiest. Be it in the delay in implementation of containment and shutdowns, misappropriation of money allocated for supporting workers and small businesses, or provision of life-saving supplies and equipment to medical and critical support personnel. A decayed and rusted social support system creaked and faltered when attempts were made to ramp it up to respond to the crisis, because of a lack of intent and habit of people running it, and a severe lack of resources. The long-term rot, which had permeated public administration and welfare systems, was fully exposed in a large number of countries. An equitable distribution of wealth across a wide segment of the society would have also prevented the sudden and widespread collapse that we got to see. If job and income disparity in the society were not so pronounced, then, even when the wheels of the world temporarily ground to a halt, the morale and ability of a large portion of people to carry on their daily existence wouldn't have broken down so completely. This psychological factor would have gone a long way in both coping with impact of shutdowns, as well as in readiness for the process of restarting the economic activity. In the same way, if collective human knowledge, which is an edifice, built layer by layer, where every culture and people, over millennia, have contributed to its evolution and accumulation, was freely available for all to use, and carry out research and development, instead of being hoarded and cornered for profit, the world would have been far better prepared to pose a stronger resistance to the attack from the virus. Another ingredient that would have gone a long way in scaling down the colossal impact, would have been the presence of a basic framework, both for universal basic healthcare, as well as a response protocol for pandemics. If a skeletal system existed for these, it could have been supercharged and scaled up. Instead, most of the governments ended up planning on their feet, developing procedures, and improvising as they went along, on account of which, people ended up paying up a huge price in form of lives, as well as livelihoods lost. The biggest factor which magnified the scale of disruption was the disastrous approach employed during the period when nations and economies were running on safe mode. The response turned out to be knee-jerk and sweeping, instead of a nuanced solution best suited to the local demographic profile, economy, and geography. The basic tenet for implementing shutdowns should have been to suspend the passage of time, and use this period to put in place systems and strategies to operationalize the new normal. The way this should have been operationalized is by suspending all non-essential transactions and actions, by a suspension of all time-dependent costs like interest, rent, and the wages of non-working personnel. There should have been made available subsistence support, which would be the cost of food and utilities, by the government, to every individual, who either did not have, or had lost a source of income, including landlords, lenders, non-operational workers, and most importantly, the jobless. It is important to understand that these payments would not be the full amount of rent, interest, or wages lost, but only the money that would enable them to tide over the period during which the economy was operating on safe mode. Likewise, unavoidable costs for businesses remaining suspended should have been reimbursed by the government. The net effect of this would have been that while businesses and people would not be making any surplus or profits, they would have been able to survive the phase of a zombie existence. Along with all these costs, the cost of healthcare would be funded by government, so that people infected would be encouraged to clock in and get the treatment at the earliest, reducing both the cost of treatment as well as fatalities, as people would not be forced to choose between life and the cost of living. This strategy would have also kept the insurance rates down. And finally, putting in place the rules and practices for allowed activities. These allowed activities could include, not just activities related to production and distribution of products and services which are essential, but also activities which could be carried on safely, while adhering to the new conditions and restrictions, even if they were not critical and essential. And, learning from experience and impact of these allowed services, strategies could have been developed to add more and more social and economic activities to the list of services allowed, and monitoring and evaluating performance and operations in these areas, devise plans for moving to the next level of rebooting the economy. Another key element that could have helped immensely in curbing both the onset of this pandemic and its spread, if mankind could have taken a serious note of, and worked on the fact that we humans occupy and exploit a far larger share of this world than we fairly should. By keeping the global population low, and its density sparse, we could have not just limited the speed of transmission of viruses, but also ensured that the finite resources of our planet were more fairly distributed and available in adequate measure to far more people. A lesser number of people would also mean that human effort and skills would be valued more, and thus be compensated better. Fewer people would also automatically mean that the incentive to mass produce at cheaper and cheaper costs would be reduced, and people and groups would move towards a culture of local self-sufficiency, instead of becoming hostage to supply chains spread far and wide. By giving more breathing space to people, and also between species, the chances of transmitting of contagion, both within the group and across species, would have been greatly reduced. The present-day mass consumption-driven industrialized way of life is an ideal breeding ground for turning any infection into a contagion catastrophe. And last, but not the least, if global institutions, instead of being promoters of global hegemony, had played the role of catalysts in global cooperation, humongous amounts of resources could be freed from perpetuation and enrichment of the military-industrial complex, and instead, these organizations could have taken a lead in establishing networks and infrastructure for cooperation in areas of security of life, disaster management, scientific research, social security and health, and thus, becoming the agents of the evolution of life on our planet, to the next level. If we had taken care of some of these things, this crisis, in fact, could have been a lot better handled, and would have not been a disaster of the scale and proportions that we see today. Having established this, we are now in a position to examine what our options are, as far as our strategy goes, for reinitializing our world. After this once-in-a-generation chance to reset the timer, and chart our course to navigate the new normal. The world, with its mechanisms of social and commercial interactions, is like a complex running engine, or a living organism. In a state of business as usual, in our world, if we have to implement any changes, like putting in place new agreements, systems, protocols, etc., these changes are in effect, like repairing a running engine, or operating on a beating heart. Very rarely does the world get an opportunity where all activity is scaled down to a minimum, and people psychologically ready for rebuilding from ground up. Only the fear of imminent death puts in us humans this level of surrender and compliance. But this state is not sustainable for long. This is why we as humans have limited time to devise and put in place an exit strategy from the status quo. Today, humanity stands at a fork in the road, where we have a choice to make and decide how the world will look once the parts of this colossal machine start moving again. The first option would be to restore the world to as close as possible to the way it was before this collapse hit us. This would involve devising strategies, and learning to adapt to new ways of living, with the additional rules of the game, which the epidemic has forced upon us. Patching up the parts that had collapsed, and restoring the supply lines that had broken down, and progressively revving up the engines of social, commercial, and economic activity. And resume our journey along the known path, and wait to be hit by the next inevitable crash. This is because the next crash to come is not going to be a result of some unknown eventuality, but is actually inherent in the design of the road that we have decided to take. But there is, in fact, another way. Instead of merely applying a scaffolding on a crumbling edifice, and repairing and covering up the cracks, we have the unique opportunity to use this moment in our lifetimes, and reconfigure the way the world works, for implementing a manifesto for a brave new world. The underlying principle of this approach can be summarized by the concept of overturning the pyramid. This approach involves demolishing the idea of sacrificing the rights of an individual, or a smaller group, in the name of a greater good. Under this approach, the process of decision-making, and the choice of a way of living life, flow from the choices made by individuals, and not from promulgations made in form of statutes, imposed by a superior authority. An individual's choices take precedence over those of a family, or group, and the choices of a smaller group take precedence over the decisions of the larger group. An individual or a group should be free to opt out from following a certain norm, custom, or rule, as long as they are ready to forego the benefits that come with it. This is because the greatest infractions of the rights and freedoms of people have been done under the pretext of service of a greater good. The next pillar of such a system would have to be the principle that every child born starts with a clean slate and a full plate. With the resources of the world belonging to all those who live in it, access to rudimentary needs of a good life would not be decided by a roll of dice. Every new inhabitant of the planet would automatically be an heir to its bounty, with a right to have an equitable access to all the things that this world has to offer, instead of an arbitrary disparity of entitlement, on account of the fact that they are born in a certain family, race, tribe, or nation. Food, a basic minimum income, healthcare, shelter, access to education, and guarantee of security of life and property, should be a fundamental and inalienable right of every individual. Under this principle, if means of sustenance are made available to every human being, wherever they are, it will eliminate the need for economic migration. This, in turn, will decongest the areas of high population concentration, and instead spread people across the world, such that they can stay in places where they have breathing space and good quality of life. Provision of means of sustenance of life, from birth till death, to every person born, will take away the need for accumulating wealth, and saving for old age, or for amassing an inheritance for successors and dependents. This will eliminate the business of profiteering from fear and insecurity, in form of insurance, which people need to buy today, for securing their own life, their lifestyle, and health, and of those dependent on them. Under such a system, all the natural resources would belong to everyone collectively, and would be made available for use to the person or group who have a plan and the ability to extract resources and produce and distribute products and services. This concept of communality would not just be limited to natural resources, but more importantly, to all the knowledge accumulated by mankind. This way, instead of a genealogical right of inheritance, the ownership of an individual's property and knowledge would pass on to people who can put it to use, and build on it further, while an individual's wealth and money would pass on to the society at large. In case the demand for any resource, like land, labor, funds, etc., exceeds its availability, The problem of allocation could be driven by market forces, and through sovereign negotiations, between the provider and the consumer of the resource, and not by any arbitrary top-down mechanism, like for example, interest rates determined by a central bank. Such a society would continuously endeavor to reduce working hours and work days, and instead use technology as a workforce and skill multiplier to make available all the products and services people need. This will eliminate the society's problem of demographic dividend, that is, the imperative to have younger people just to take care of older people, and instead liberate human effort and intellect, so it can be applied more and more in the pursuit of technological and cultural evolution. Beyond survival and socio-economic interactions, these values and the underlying philosophy would also need to address other human activities and needs, so they are in harmony with the overarching thought. For example, because unlike other products of human endeavor, the artistic expression is difficult to value and quantify objectively. The way the artist in each individual is allowed unfettered expression, will be the litmus test for the success of any system that values an individual above all. In any civilized society, all forms of abstract human expression should be liberated from the demands of the market, or the machinations of spin doctors, who dictate to us what is art and what is not. Once freed of the shackles of commercial viability, artists would be able to create artistic work which is a true expression of themselves, rather than being forced to become cogs in a machine, and forced to produce art for livelihood. To this end, the infrastructure and platforms of creating art, and also bringing it within the reach of patrons, should be facilitated by the society, and universally accessible, such that, while on one side, the artist need not bother about anything else other than giving expression to their creativity, on the other side, anyone who loves and appreciates art gets to experience it, without being constrained by their social status or economic conditions. Likewise, a philosophy congruent with the bedrock of the values of the new system could also impact the way we look at human activities like sports. Sports might need to be seen more as a tool for achieving physical well-being, and keeping the body and the mind fit and sharp, instead of being used as an instrument for intoxicating the masses, by feeding their violent instincts, like the ancient Romans, boisterously roaring at the barbaric and violent contests between gladiators at the circus. In this context, the question that would be pertinent to ask is, if everybody gets the means of sustenance, as a matter of right, who, then, will be working? The answer is everybody. Only, they will be doing things they enjoy to do, and not forced to do things just to survive. When people do what they love doing, they are more productive. If survival was the most potent driver, then slavery would be the most productive form of running a society. Instead, we know that satisfied employees are the most productive ones. The fallacy that has been long promoted, by a system that works for the enrichment of the few, to the detriment of a large number of people, is, that the profit motive makes human beings achieve more. This falsehood flies flat in the face of the history of human development. Both as individuals, and as cultures, we have seen that pinnacles of philosophical thought, artistic expression, and leaps of scientific progress were achieved by people who were driven either by a challenge to their way of life, or, when cultures and civilizations attained high levels of prosperity, and a large number of people were free from the struggle of daily survival and drudgery. Profit motive, as a matter of fact, taints cultural and moral growth, and becomes an impediment for broad-based technological and cultural evolution. In the new society that we must strive to build, individual and societal needs, visions of a better future, and brilliant sparks of ideas, and not a lust for accumulating great wealth, should be the drivers of productivity and innovation. In such an environment, any individual or group would be free to get into the production and provision of any product or service at will. This, coupled with universal access to knowledge, would make the concept of monopolies untenable. With the elimination of gaping disparities across nations, the world would be able to move towards opening up of borders, and the liquidation of the concept of nation-states. This, when coupled with availability of means of sustenance everywhere, the world, and especially parts of the world with a limited capacity to support large populations, like islands and desert nations, would see a scaling down of the pressure of humans on land, and attain levels of population that these areas can comfortably support for extended periods of time, with local resources. In such a system, the society will be the government. Decision-making in the running of a household, an organization, a business, a geographical region, or the affairs of the world, will be determined by the will of the people who form that unit, and an individual's role in it will be based on their personality, skills, abilities, and the willingness to discharge the role. An individual thus would perform many roles, and one role could be shared by many. In line with this, global institutions would need to be configured to become the facilitators of this new world order. These organizations, comprised of representatives of people, would largely be the aggregators of opinion and knowledge of the world, setting standards and best practices for all aspects of life. Their output would, however, be only in the way of recommendations. Groups and individuals would be free to adopt, adapt, or reject these ideas, so that social space is always available for alternative opinions and ways of life. The results of these alternatives could be fed back into the process of evaluating and setting standards and best practices for future. Like in the rest of the society, there would be no entitlement or class system in the administration of organizations, by way of a coterie or a supergroup, like we have currently, in the concept of the Security Council. Decision-making, and voting power, would need to be equitably distributed across all people represented. No coercive, punitive, or other measures, which are in the nature of sanctions, or a military action, should be undertaken, unless there is an extremely large consensus for the same. All ownership, and administration of lethal and military equipment, and infrastructure, would be in the hands of global institutions, and this infrastructure and its control, would be strategically, and proportionately, distributed across the globe. Further, all the production and administration of defensive and offensive equipment, would be solely on a non-profit basis. This would take away the motive of instigating conflict, wars, social discord, or other forms of violence, for making profit. Once we are able to free up a large amount of resources currently being spent on defense, and eliminate profiteering from conflict, the domain of security and law enforcement would also evolve, and need to be transformed radically. Driven by the twin principles of a guarantee of protection from harm, and the absolute liberty of an individual, the concept of an individual or group's freedom would be expanded to a great extent, such that it is limited only in cases where it amounts to an infringement of the freedom of another individual or group. In such a system, concepts like sedition, treason, heresy, libel and defamation, prohibition, etc., will no more be reasons for legal action. No expression or act should be curbed, unless it can be demonstrated that it is a source of an imminent, or actual physical harm, to another individual, or their property. This would greatly prune down the complexity of legislation. Also, there would need to be a redefinition of principles around the concepts of responsibility, like in cases of possession or use of any equipment or substances, the ability of a person to give consent, or participate in some form of vote, culpability of an individual for any harm done, and imposition of isolation and incarceration to protect any harm to society, etc. The application of all these principles would need to be evaluated and ascertained, based on scientific, individual, and circumstantial factors, rather than broad and antiquated rule-of-thumb guidelines, like a person's age. Also, the element of state-sanctioned violence, and retribution, would need to be abandoned in delivery of justice, and instead, the focus of the law enforcement and the justice system, should be on prevention of further harm, and on restitution and rehabilitation of the victims. Fewer and fewer number of people would also necessitate developing an ability to create goods and services in sufficient quantities, so as to be able to meet all the needs of everybody, with minimum human intervention. This would not only mean greater and greater automation of production of goods and services, and making the environment we live in intelligent and autonomous, but also a prolonging of human life, quantitatively and qualitatively, by targeted progress in the areas of bionics and other technologies that could delay, and ultimately eliminate, the degeneration of human body and mind. And developing the capability of taking, in a manner of speaking, a backup of the human mind, and what is referred to as the human conscience, with the ultimate aim of freeing the human existence, knowledge, memories, and overall experience of being a human, from the constraints of being trapped in a media that is prone to decay, which is the human body and brain. In the end, as for making any other momentous change, the key to making this leap would also lie in choosing the right leaders, not just political, but thought leaders, who will have the capability, and the moral fortitude, to steer our ship away from its current course, which has been demonstrated, time and again, to be fraught with recurring perils, like the one we face right now, and instead, who can lead us into a brave new world. The portal, to be in the vanguard of taking life to the next level of evolution, opened up for us humans, more than 5 million years ago, when somewhere in Africa, a small group of hominids decided to take a direction very different from their peers, which got us started on the long journey on which we still are today. If we are to embark upon this new course for a better future, we collectively have to answer the questions that loom large before us today. Whether we will be the architects of our own destruction before we reach this goal, and, instead of us, and on this planet, some other organism, in some other eon, in some other part of the universe, will make this journey. Whether we will stumble, falter, and take a crude and tedious route, fraught with pain and failures, or whether we will pull together as a race and people to not just get there, but also take along with us as many as possible of our brothers and sisters who can join us in this journey into this great future. With this, we come to the end of our two-part discussion on the dimensions and the nature of the rot that lies at the roots of the deep distress that plagues our world today, and how we can use this moment of reckoning and the pause to change our course and our way of life for a better future. I hope you found this thought-provoking. If so, please share your thoughts and concerns on the ideas in these videos, as well as any opinion on improvement, refinement, or doubts that you may have, arising from this discussion, in the section for comments below. It would be nice if you could click the like button and share the video with other people who you think may find it interesting. Also, please do subscribe to the channel and click the all notifications icon, so that you get notified as and when we publish our new videos. Till later then. Have a great time, and stay safe. Bye.